My name is Howard Mitchell. I'm a photographer. And in the summer of 1964, I was sent on assignment to document the effects of a severe drought in Kentucky for National Geographic. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip, take some pictures, write a few notes, and head back home. But what happened at Lake Cumberland changed my life forever. I wasn't alone on this trip. My wife, Evelyn, and our 12-year-old son, Samuel, came along. Evelyn had grown up in a small town called Stillwater, which was now buried beneath the lake. Years ago, the government flooded the town to create a reservoir. Evelyn hadn't been back since she was a little girl, but with the drought lowering the water levels, parts of Stillwater were starting to resurface. She wanted to see what was left of her childhood home. We arrived in our 1962 Airstream Land yacht, a shiny silver RV that I'd modified with a small dark room for developing my photos. We parked on a newly exposed stretch of land that had once been Stillwater's main street. The lake had receded so much that we could see the tops of old buildings, church steeples, rooftops, sticking out of the water like ghosts from another time. It was eerie, but fascinating. Evelyn seemed quiet as we set up camp. She kept staring out at the water like she was searching for something or someone. Samuel, on the other hand, was excited. He loved exploring new places and couldn't wait to poke around the old ruins with me. That first evening, as I unpacked my camera gear and set up my dark room inside the RV, I noticed something strange. The air inside felt damp and cold, colder than it should have been for a summer night. I figured it was just because we were so close to the water, but then I saw it, condensation forming on one of the windows in swirling patterns, almost like faces. I wiped it away with my sleeve and laughed it off. Just my imagination, I told myself. Evelyn called us for dinner shortly after that. We ate outside under the fading light of the sun while Samuel asked her endless questions about what Stillwater used to be like. She told him about the old general store where her father used to work and the little church where her family went every Sunday. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she smiled through it. That night, as we settled into bed inside the RV, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Something about this place felt off, like it didn't want us there. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of water dripping. At first, I thought it was rain, but when I looked out the window, the sky was clear. The sound was coming from inside the RV. I got up quietly, so I wouldn't wake Evelyn or Samuel, and followed the noise. There it was, water pooling on the floor near the sink. I checked the faucet, but it wasn't leaking. The pipes were dry too. I grabbed a towel and cleaned it up. But as soon as I turned my back, I heard another drip. When I looked again, there was more water, like it had just appeared out of nowhere. I shook my head and muttered to myself, probably just condensation, but deep down, it didn't feel right. Later that day, we decided to explore the exposed parts of Stillwater. Evelyn led us through what used to be the town square. The ground was muddy and uneven, with bits of brick and stone poking through. Samuel ran ahead, kicking rocks and pointing at everything he saw. "Was this your school, Mom?" he asked, stopping in front of a crumbling building. Evelyn smiled faintly. "No, that was the post office. My school SIP's probably still underwater." As she spoke, her eyes kept drifting toward the lake. It was like she couldn't look away from it for too long. I snapped a few pictures of her standing there, the lake stretching out behind her like a giant mirror. The water was so still it reflected everything perfectly, the sky, the trees, even us. But when I developed those photos later that evening in my darkroom, something wasn't right. In one of them, the one where Evelyn stood by the lake, there were figures in the background, faint and blurry, but definitely there. They looked like people standing in the water watching us. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a flaw in the film. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself of that, I couldn't shake the feeling that those figures were real. I didn't mention it to Evelyn or Samuel. No point in scaring them over something that might just be my imagination. But that night, as we sat around a small fire outside the RV, Samuel said something that sent chills down my spine. "Mom," he said casually while poking at the fire with a stick, "who are the kids by the water?" Evelyn froze. "What kids?" He pointed toward the lake. Over there. They stir, waving at me. I turned to look but saw nothing, just darkness and the faint shimmer of moonlight on the water. There's seps no one there, I said quickly. Samuel frowned. But they sit right there. They said they want to play. Evelyn grabbed his arm gently but firmly. Samuel, she said softly but firmly, stay away from the water. He nodded, though he looked confused. After that, none of us said much for the rest of the night. As we climbed into bed later on, I couldn't help but glance out at the lake one last time through the RV window. It looked calm and peaceful, too calm. And then I saw it, a ripple in the water where there shouldn't have been one. The next few days were strange. It felt like the lake was watching us. I know that sounds crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I looked out at the water, I expected to see something or someone staring back at me. Samuel started acting differently too. He'd always been a curious kid, but now he was quiet and distracted. He spent hours sitting by the shore, staring at the lake like he was waiting for something. Evelyn told him to stay close to the RV, but he didn't always listen. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. At first I thought it was an animal, but then I heard humming a soft, high-pitched tune that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. Samuel? I called out. No answer. I shined the light around and saw him standing by the water's edge. His back was to me and his bare feet were covered in mud. He was humming that same tune, swaying slightly as if he were in a trance. Samuel, I shouted, running toward him. He turned around slowly, his face pale and blank. They're here, he said quietly. Who's here? I asked, grabbing his shoulders. The water children, he whispered. They want me to come play. I pulled him away from the shore and back to the RV. Evelyn woke up as we came inside, her face full of worry. What happened? She asked. He was outside, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. By the water. She looked at Samuel with wide eyes. Samuel, she said firmly, you can go near the lake again. Do you understand? He nodded but didn't say anything. After that night, things got worse. Samuel started sleepwalking almost every night. No matter how tightly we locked the RV doors, we'd wake up to find him outside, always near the water. Sometimes he'd be covered in algae or mud, even though he swore he hadn't gone into the lake. Evelyn was terrified. She stayed up late every night just to keep an eye on him, but even she couldn't stop him from wandering off completely. It was like something was calling him, pulling him toward the lake. Meanwhile, I kept noticing strange things inside the RV. The water damage wasn't getting better, it was getting worse. The floor felt damp all the time now, even though there hadn't been any rain. The condensation on the windows kept forming those swirling patterns that looked like faces. One afternoon, while Evelyn and Samuel were outside exploring some ruins near the shore, I decided to check under the RV for leaks. What I found made my stomach drop. The underside of the RV was bone dry, no leaks anywhere, but there were wet handprints smeared across it. They were small, like a child's hands. I scrambled back inside and locked all the doors, my heart racing. When Evelyn and Samuel returned later that evening, I didn't tell them what I'd seen. I didn't want to scare them any more than they already were. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right with this place, something dangerous. That night, I decided to develop the photos I had taken earlier in the week. I needed something to distract myself from everything that had been happening. I set up my dark room in the RV and started working while Evelyn and Samuel slept. As I dipped the first photo into the developing solution, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air inside the RV was ice cold, even though it was the middle of summer. My hands shook as I pulled the photo out of the tray and held it up to the red light. It was a picture of Evelyn standing by the lake, just like before, but this time the figures in the background weren't blurry. They were clear. They looked like children, their faces pale and waterlogged, with black, empty eyes. They were standing right behind her, close enough to touch her. I dropped the photo and backed away, my heart pounding. No, I whispered to myself. This isn't real. But it felt real. Too real. I grabbed another photo and held it up. This one showed Samuel sitting by the shore, staring at the water, and there they were again. The same figures, standing in the lake and watching him. I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled as I flipped through every photo I had developed that night. In every single one, those figures were there, always in the background, always watching us. I stumbled out of the dark room and into the main part of the RV. Evelyn was awake now, sitting at the table with a worried look on her face. "What's wrong?" she asked. I hesitated for a moment before showing her one of the photos. Her face went pale as she stared at it. "Howard," she whispered. "What is this?" "I don't know," I said honestly, "but they sat there in every picture." She looked at me with wide eyes, her voice trembling. "They look like kids." Samuel stirred in his bed and sat up suddenly. "The water children," he said quietly. Evelyn turned to him, her voice sharp but shaky. "Samuel, what are you talking about?" "They're here," he said simply, pointing toward the window. We both froze and turned to look outside. At first, all we saw was darkness, the lake shimmering faintly under the moonlight. But then we saw them. Figures standing in the shallow water near our RV, motionless and silent. Their skin was pale and bloated, covered in algae that clung to their bodies like a second skin. Their black eyes glinted in the moonlight as they stared at us. Evelyn gasped and grabbed Samuel's arm tightly. "Don't look," she whispered. My hands shook as I reached for my camera, but as soon as I raised it to take a picture, they vanished, disappearing into thin air like they had never been there at all. Evelyn turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Howard," she said softly but firmly, "we need to leave." I nodded, but deep down I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. The next morning, Evelyn insisted we leave. She was scared, more scared than I'd ever seen her. But when I tried to drive the RV back toward the main road, something strange happened. The dirt path we had come in on was flooded. The water stretched out in front of us, blocking the way completely. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, stepping out of the RV to get a closer look. The sky was clear, and there hadn't been any rain. But the water was there, shimmering in the sunlight as if it had always been. Evelyn stood beside me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. The lake wasn't just a place, it was something else. Something alive. Samuel stayed close to Evelyn as we walked back to the RV. He hadn't said much since last night, but he kept glancing toward the water like he was expecting someone or something to appear. That afternoon, we decided to look for help. Evelyn remembered that her great-aunt Louise had refused to leave Stillwater when it was flooded years ago. "She might still be here," Evelyn said hopefully. "She had a shack near the shore." We followed Evelyn's directions and eventually found the shack, a small weathered building tucked away in the trees near the lake. It looked abandoned at first, but when Evelyn knocked on the door, an old woman opened it. Louise Carter was thin and frail, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through us. She stared at Evelyn for a long moment before saying, "You Stev, come back." Evelyn nodded hesitantly. "Aunt Louise, we need your help." Louise stepped aside and let us in. The inside of the shack was cluttered with old furniture and stacks of yellowed papers. The air smelled damp and earthy, like the lake itself. As we sat down at her small table, Louise spoke in a low voice. "You shouldn't have come here," she said bluntly. "We didn't have a choice," Evelyn replied. "The drought, it exposed part of Stillwater." Louise's eyes narrowed. Stillwater should stay buried. I leaned forward, my curiosity getting the better of me. "What do you mean?" Louise sighed heavily and looked at me with a grim expression. "The town wasn't just flooded for the reservoir," she said slowly. "It was flooded to keep them contained." "Who?" Evelyn asked nervously. "The lake spirits," Louise said simply. I frowned. "Lake spirits?" Louise nodded and gestured toward the stack of papers on her table. "Before Stillwater was flooded, there was a cult here, a group of people who worshipped something in the lake. They called them the Drowned. They believed these spirits could grant them power or protection if they made sacrifices. Evelyn's face went pale. Sacrifices? Louise nodded again. They take people, children mostly, and offer them to the lake. I felt sick to my stomach as I listened to her story. It sounded impossible, but after everything we'd seen, I couldn't dismiss it. The spirits were angry when Stillwater was flooded, Louise continued. They lost their followers, their sacrifices, but they still here waiting for someone to bring them back. Evelyn grabbed Samuel's arm protectively. We need to leave, she said firmly. Louise shook her head slowly. You can leave, she said softly but firmly. Not until they get what they want. We left Louise Sepp's shack feeling worse than before. Her words stayed with me, repeating in my head like an echo. You can leave, not until they get what they want. Evelyn held Samuel's hand tightly as we walked back to the RV. She didn't say a word, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Samuel was quiet too, his gaze fixed on the ground. I wanted to tell them everything would be fine, but I couldn't. I didn't know if it would be. When we got back to the RV, things were different. The air inside felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. The water damage had spread. There were wet streaks running down the walls now, and the floor felt damp no matter where we stepped. It smelled like the lake, earthy and stale. That night, we locked all the doors and windows and tried to sleep. Evelyn stayed up with Samuel, sitting by his bed and stroking his hair to keep him calm. I stayed by the window, watching the lake. Around midnight, I heard it again, that humming. It was soft at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind, but it grew louder, filling the air with an eerie melody that made my skin crawl. I looked out the window and froze. They were back, the figures in the water. This time there were more of them, dozens of pale, bloated shapes standing in the shallow water near our RV. Their black eyes glinted in the moonlight as they stared at us. I turned away from the window and grabbed Evelyn's arm. They're here, I whispered. She looked at me with wide eyes, her face pale. What do we do? She asked. Before I could answer, we heard a loud thud from outside, like something heavy had hit the side of the RV. Samuel sat up suddenly, his eyes wide with fear. There's spur knocking, he said softly. Evelyn pulled him close as another thud echoed through the RV. Then another, and another. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door just enough to shine it outside. The figures were gone, but there were wet handprints smeared across the side of the RV. They were small, like a child's hands. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my heart pounding in my chest. We can't stay here, I said firmly. But where can we go? Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. I didn't yet have an answer. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. None of us slept. We just sat there listening to every creak and groan of the RV, waiting for something to happen. By morning, we were exhausted but still alive. The lake looked calm again, too calm, and there was no sign of the figures from last night. But I knew they weren't gone. They were waiting, watching us. And then we noticed something else. Samuel's shoes were missing. We searched everywhere for them, but couldn't find them anywhere inside the RV or outside near our camp. That's when Evelyn spotted them, sitting neatly by the water's edge, covered in algae and mud. Evelyn froze when she saw Samuel Sepp's shoes by the water. She grabbed his arm and pulled him close. Her voice shaky but firm. Samuel, she said, did you go outside last night? He shook his head quickly. No, Mom, I didn't set. I wanted to believe him, but the shoes told a different story. They were sitting there so perfectly, like someone had placed them there on purpose. Evelyn Sepp's grip on Samuel tightened as she looked at me. Howard, she whispered. We stir not safe here. I nodded, my stomach twisting into knots. She was right. We weren't safe, but I didn't know how to get us out. The road back to shore was still flooded, and the water didn't look like it was going anywhere. I decided to check the radio for updates. Maybe someone had reported the flooding, or maybe there was help nearby. But when I turned it on, all I got was static. No voices, no music, nothing. It was like we were completely cut off from the world. Evelyn paced back and forth inside the RV, her hands shaking as she tried to think of a plan. Samuel sat quietly at the table, staring out the window at the lake. I kept glancing at him, worried about how quiet he had become. And then it happened. The water inside the RV started dripping again, first from the sink, then from the ceiling. It wasn't much at first, just a few drops here and there, but within minutes, it was everywhere. Tiny streams of water running down the walls and pooling on the floor. Evelyn grabbed a towel and tried to wipe it up, but it was useless. The water kept coming, no matter how hard we tried to stop it. "It's like it's alive," Evelyn muttered under her breath. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. The water wasn't behaving like normal water. It felt wrong. And then Samuel spoke. "They start coming," he said softly. Evelyn and I froze and turned to look at him. His eyes were fixed on the window, his face pale and blank. "Whose ship's coming?" Evelyn asked nervously. "The water children," he replied simply. I rushed to the window and looked out at the lake. At first, I didn't see anything, just the calm surface of the water reflecting the sky above. But then I saw them. Figures rising out of the lake, slowly and silently, like they were being pulled up by invisible strings. Their skin was pale and bloated, covered in algae that dripped off their bodies as they moved. Their black eyes stared straight at us as they walked toward the RV. "Howard," Evelyn whispered urgently. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. My mind raced as I tried to think of something, anything that could keep us safe. The figures stopped just outside the RV, standing motionless in a circle around us. They didn't knock or make any noise this time. They just stood there watching us through the windows with those empty black eyes. Samuel stood up suddenly and walked toward the door. "Samuel," Evelyn shouted, grabbing his arm before he could open it. "They want me," he said calmly. "No," Evelyn said firmly, pulling him back toward her. "You're not going anywhere." The figures outside didn't move. They just kept staring at us through the windows like they were waiting for something. And then we heard it, a loud creaking sound coming from beneath us. The RV shifted slightly, tilting to one side as if something was pushing against it from below. "They're trying to get in," Evelyn whispered fearfully. I grabbed her hand tightly and pulled Samuel close to us. "We still stay together," I said firmly. "No matter what happens." The RV creaked again, tilting slightly as if something heavy was pressing against it. Evelyn clutched Samuel tightly, her knuckles white. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to think of what to do. The figures outside hadn't moved, but their presence felt suffocating. It was like the air inside the RV had grown thicker, harder to breathe. And then Evelyn gasped. Her eyes widened as she let go of Samuel and grabbed her head with both hands. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no." "Evelyn," I shouted, rushing to her side. "What's wrong?" She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "I can feel it," she said, her voice trembling. "I can feel the water. It's seps in my lungs." Her words sent chills down my spine. She was gasping for air now, clutching her chest like she was drowning, even though we were nowhere near the water. "It's seps not real," I said desperately, trying to calm her down. "Evelyn, you stare okay. You stare not drowning." But she didn't seem to hear me. Her breathing grew more frantic as she collapsed onto the floor, coughing and choking like she was trying to expel water from her lungs. Samuel watched silently, his face pale and expressionless. "They're showing her," he said softly. "Showing her what?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What it feels like," he replied simply. I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't have time to think about it. Evelyn's coughing slowed, and she lay still on the floor, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she tried to catch her breath. I knelt beside her and held her hand tightly. "Evelyn," I said softly, "look at me." She opened her eyes slowly and stared at me with a haunted expression. "I was there," she whispered. "Where?" I asked gently. "In the lake," she said. I could feel it, the cold water pulling me down. "It wasn't real?" I said firmly, trying to convince both of us. "You stir here with us. You stir safe." But deep down, I wasn't set sure if that was true. Evelyn sat up slowly, still trembling. She looked at Samuel with tears in her eyes. "They're trying to take him," she said quietly. I shook my head. "We once let them." She nodded, but didn't look convinced. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tension and fear. We stayed inside the RV with all the doors and windows locked, too scared to step outside. The figures had disappeared again by morning, but we knew they weren't gone for good. That night, as we tried to sleep, Evelyn woke up screaming. "They're here," she shouted, sitting bolt upright in bed. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, but there was nothing outside, just darkness and the faint shimmer of moonlight on the lake. "What did you see?" I asked her urgently. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't set outside," she whispered. "It was inside." Her words sent a chill through me. I looked around the RV nervously, but didn't see anything unusual, just shadows cast by the dim light from our lantern. But then I noticed something on the wall near Evelyn's bed, wet streaks running down in strange patterns that almost looked like writing. I leaned closer to get a better look and felt my stomach drop when I realized what it said: "Give him back." The writing on the wall froze me in place. She give him back. The words dripped down like they had been carved into the wet streaks on the RV's walls. Evelyn stared at it, her breathing shallow, while Samuel sat quietly at the table, his gaze fixed on the floor. "They want him," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "Howard, they want Samuel." I shook my head fiercely. "No, they can have him." But deep down, I knew we were running out of options. The lake wasn't just a place anymore. It was alive and it was angry. It wanted something from us, and it wasn't going to stop until it got it. Samuel stood up suddenly and walked toward the door. "Samuel," Evelyn shouted, grabbing his arm before he could open it. "They kept calling me," he said calmly, his voice eerily steady. "I have to go." "No," Evelyn cried, pulling him back toward her. "You're not going anywhere." I rushed to the door and locked it tightly, my hands shaking. "Samuel," I said firmly, kneeling in front of him, "you don't have to listen to them. You're safe here with us." He looked at me with wide eyes, eyes that seemed older than they should being. "They're not bad," he said softly. "They just want to come back." Evelyn's grip on his arm tightened. "What are you talking about?" she asked desperately. Samuel tilted his head slightly, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. "They used to live here," he explained quietly, "before the water took them." I exchanged a worried glance with Evelyn. Louisa's story flashed through my mind. The cult, the sacrifices, the spirits trapped in the lake. It all felt too real now. Suddenly, we heard a loud splash outside, like something heavy had hit the water. Evelyn pulled Samuel close as I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door. The lake was rippling violently now, even though there was no wind, and then I saw it. A trail of wet footprints leading from the shore to our RV. I shined the flashlight around but didn't see anyone or anything nearby, but I could feel it. Something was out there, watching us. I stepped back inside and locked the door again, my heart racing. "We need to leave," I said urgently. "How?" Evelyn asked desperately. "The road is still flooded." I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't stay here any longer. And then Samuel spoke again. "They are waiting for us," he said simply. "Waiting for what?" I asked nervously. He pointed toward the lake. "They want us to go there." Evelyn shook her head fiercely. "No, we're not going near that water." But Samuel didn't seem scared anymore. He seemed calm, almost peaceful. "It's okay," he said softly. "They don't want to hurt me." Evelyn grabbed his shoulders and looked him straight in the eye. "Samuel," she said firmly, her voice shaking with fear and anger. "You are not going anywhere near that lake. Do you understand me?" He nodded slowly but didn't say anything else. That night was the worst one yet. The RV creaked and groaned as if something heavy was pressing against it from all sides. The air inside felt damp and cold, and we could hear faint whispers coming from outside, soft voices calling Samuel's name over and over again. Evelyn stayed awake all night holding Samuel tightly, while I kept watch by the window. Every time I looked out at the lake, I saw shadows moving beneath the surface, dark shapes that seemed to be circling our RV like predators waiting for their prey. By morning, Samuel was gone. Evelyn's scream woke me up. It was sharp and panicked, cutting through the early morning silence like a knife. I jumped out of bed and rushed to her side. She was standing by Samuel's empty bed, her hands trembling as she clutched his blanket. "He's Sep's gone," she cried, her voice breaking. I looked around frantically, calling his name, "Samuel, Samuel." But there was no response, just the eerie quiet of the RV and the faint sound of water dripping from the walls. Evelyn grabbed my arm tightly, her eyes wide with fear. "Howard," she whispered, "they took him." I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew she was right. The lake had been calling him for days, and now it had him. We ran outside, searching desperately for any sign of him. The ground near the shore was muddy and uneven, but then Evelyn spotted something, Samuel's footprints leading toward the water. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no." We followed the footprints until they stopped abruptly at the edge of the lake. The water was calm again, too calm, and there was no sign of Samuel anywhere. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "He's gone," she sobbed. I refused to give up. "Sep's not gone," I said firmly. "We Sep's find him." But I didn't know how. Desperate for answers, we decided to go back to Louise's shack. She had warned us about the spirits in the lake. Maybe she knew how to stop them. When we arrived at her shack, Louise was sitting outside in a rickety old chair, staring out at the lake with a grim expression on her face. She didn't seem surprised to see us. "They took him," Evelyn said before Louise could speak. "Please, tell us how to get him back." Louise sighed heavily and gestured for us to come inside. We followed her into the cluttered shack and sat down at her small table. "They don't take people for no reason," Louise said slowly. "They only take what they think belongs to them." "What does that mean?" I asked urgently. Louise looked at Evelyn with a knowing expression. "You grew up here," she said softly. "You know what this town used to be." Evelyn shook her head fiercely. "I don't know anything about sacrifices or spirits. My family wasn't part of that." Louise nodded, but didn't look convinced. She pulled out an old ledger from one of her stacks of papers and opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwritten notes about Stillwater's history. "This town had secrets," Louise said quietly. "Dark secrets." She pointed to a list of names written in faded ink, names of people who had been sacrificed to the lake over the years. Evelyn gasped when she saw one name in particular. "Margaret Carter." "That Sep's my grandmother," she whispered. Louise nodded grimly. "She was one of them, a follower of the drowned." Evelyn shook her head in disbelief. "No, that can be true." But Louise didn't stop there. She flipped through more pages until she found another name, Samuel Carter. Evelyn froze when she saw it. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Louise looked at us both with a somber expression. "The spirits think Samuel belongs to them because of your family Sep's connection to this town." Evelyn buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I felt sick to my stomach as I tried to process what Louise had told us. "Is there a way to stop them?" I asked desperately. Louise hesitated before answering. "There is one way," she said slowly, "but it comes with a price." "What price?" Evelyn asked through her tears. Louise looked at her sadly and said, "You have to give them something they want more than Samuel." Evelyn Sep's face went pale at Louise Sep's words. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What could they want more than Samuel?" Louise hesitated, her eyes darting toward the lake visible through the small window of her shack. "They want someone who belongs to Stillwater," she said softly. "Someone with a connection to this place." Evelyn shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, I can stet." "You said the only one who can stop this," Louise said firmly. "If you offer yourself to them, they should let Samuel go." I grabbed Evelyn Sepp's hand tightly. "There has to be another way," I said desperately. "We still find him. We still fight them." "You can fight the lake," Louise interrupted. Her voice sharp but sad. "It sits not just water, it sits them, and they don't let go unless they given something in return." Evelyn looked at me, her eyes filled with fear and love and pain all at once. "Howard," she whispered. "He Sepp's our son." I shook my head fiercely. "We'll find another way," I said again, even though I didn't believe it myself. But Evelyn had already made up her mind. She stood up slowly and wiped the tears from her face. "She'd take me to him," she said to Louise. "No," I shouted, grabbing her arm. "Evelyn, you can do this." She turned to me and placed a hand on my cheek. "Howard," she said softly, "you have to protect Samuel. He needs you." I felt my throat tighten as I fought back tears. "I need you," I whispered. She smiled faintly and kissed me on the forehead. "You'll be okay," she said. Louise led us back to the lake where the water was eerily still under the gray morning sky. Evelyn stepped forward without hesitation, her bare feet sinking into the muddy shore. "Samuel," she called out. At first, there was nothing, just silence and the faint ripple of water against the shore, but then we saw him. He was standing near the exposed steeple of the old church that had once been at the center of Stillwater. The water came up to his knees, but he didn't seem scared or cold. He just stood there, staring at us with a blank expression. "Samuel." Evelyn shouted again, taking a step into the water. The figures began to rise around him, pale and bloated and covered in algae, their black eyes fixed on us as they emerged from beneath the surface. They formed a circle around Samuel, their movements slow and deliberate. Evelyn turned to me one last time. Her voice was calm but firm as she said, "Take care of him." Before I could stop her, she waded into the lake. The water came up to her waist as she approached Samuel and the figures surrounding him. She reached out for him, but one of the spirits stepped between them. A tall figure with long hair tangled with weeds and algae dripping from its arms. Evelyn didn't flinch. She looked straight into its empty black eyes and said, "Take me instead." The spirit tilted its head slightly, as if considering her offer. Then it reached out with one webbed hand and touched her forehead lightly. Evelyn gasped sharply and fell to her knees in the water. "Evelyn," I shouted, running toward the shore. But before I could reach her, the spirits began to sink back into the lake, taking Evelyn with them. Her eyes met mine one last time before she disappeared beneath the surface. And then it was over. The lake grew still again, and Samuel collapsed onto the muddy shore like a puppet whose strings had been cut. I ran to him and pulled him into my arms, holding him tightly as tears streamed down my face. "Dad," he whispered weakly. "Is Seb here?" I said through my sobs. "I've got you." But Evelyn was gone. The rain came that night, a heavy, relentless downpour that seemed to drown the world. The lake swelled quickly, swallowing the exposed ruins of Stillwater until there was nothing left but water. The steeple disappeared beneath the surface, and the muddy shore turned into a rippling expanse of black. Samuel and I sat inside the RV, listening to the rain hammering against the roof. He was quiet, his small hands clutching Evelyn's blanket tightly. I didn't know what to say to him. I didn't even know how to process what had just happened. Evelyn was gone, but she had saved him. She had given herself to the lake so Samuel could live. It was a sacrifice I couldn't begin to understand, but it was one I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The next morning, when the rain finally stopped, I packed up the RV and drove us away from Lake Cumberland. The road that had been flooded was clear now, as if the lake had decided to let us go. Samuel stared out the window as we drove, his face pale and blank. He didn't say much, and neither did I. We left Stillwater behind, but it never really left us. Years passed. Samuel grew up, but he never talked about what happened at the lake, not to me, not to anyone. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at water, puddles, rivers, even reflections in glass, and I'd wonder if he could still feel them watching him. When Samuel became a father himself, He decided to take his family on a camping trip near Lake Cumberland. He said he wanted to show his daughter where Evelyn had grown up. I didn't try to stop him. I knew he needed closure. They parked their RV on the same stretch of land where we had camped all those years ago. The drought had returned again, lowering the water level and exposing parts of Stillwater once more. That night, as Samuel tucked his daughter into bed inside their RV, she looked up at him with wide eyes and said something that sent chills down his spine. "Daddy," she whispered softly. "Grandma came to visit me." Samuel froze. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. "She was standing by my bed," his daughter said simply. "She smelled like the lake." Samuel didn't sleep much that night. He sat by the window of the RV, staring out at the water and waiting for something or someone to appear. But all he saw was his reflection in the glass, and hers standing beside him. My name is Raymond Foster. I'm a 44-year-old physics teacher, but I wasn't always just a teacher. Back in my younger days, I was a ham radio enthusiast. I'd spend hours tinkering with old equipment, talking to strangers across the world through static-filled frequencies. It was my passion. But life has a way of pulling you away from the things you love. A failed marriage, a teenage daughter who barely talks to me, and a job that feels more like routine than purpose. Well, let's just say I needed a break. That's how I ended up here, in the middle of Nevada's Black Rock Desert, with my 15-year-old daughter Tina. She didn't want to come. Of course, what teenager wants to spend their summer in an old RV with their dad? But I promised her it would be worth it. An unforgettable meteor shower, crystal clear skies, and maybe even some father-daughter bonding. The desert stretched endlessly around us, salt flats shimmering under the sun, jagged rock formations jutting out like ancient monuments, and an eerie silence that made you feel like you were the last person on Earth. There were rumors about this place, whispers of forgotten nuclear test sites and strange radiation hotspots. But to me, it was perfect. A quiet spot far from the noise of the world where I could set up my radio equipment and listen to the stars. Our RV wasn't just any old motorhome. It was my pride and joy, a 1982 Southwind I'd converted into a mobile radio station. Inside, it was packed with equipment I'd spent years restoring, military-grade receivers from the 1950s, antenna rigs that could pick up signals from halfway across the globe, and even a few custom modifications of my own. Tina called it Dad's Nerd Cave on Wheels. She wasn't wrong. We arrived just before sunset. The desert air was dry and warm, with a faint smell of dust and sagebrush. Tina sat on a folding chair outside the RV, her nose buried in one of her sci-fi novels. She loved those stories, aliens, spaceships, parallel worlds, but she never seemed to think her dad's hobby was half as interesting as the books she read. "Hey," I said, stepping out of the RV with a pair of binoculars. "You gonna miss it if you don't look up." She sighed dramatically but put down her book and took the binoculars. "Fine," she muttered. As the first stars began to appear in the sky, I felt a flicker of excitement I hadn't felt in years. This was going to be good for both of us. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the desert turned cool and quiet. The stars came out one by one, filling the sky with a brilliance you could never see back in the city. Tina was lying on a blanket outside, staring up at the sky, while I sat inside the RV, adjusting my radio equipment. This was my moment. Just me, my machines, and the vastness of space. I turned the dials carefully, searching for signals. The hum of static filled the RV, comforting in its familiarity. I'd been doing this for years, and most of the time all you'd get was noise or faint whispers from distant stations. But tonight felt different. There was something about the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And then I heard it. At first, it sounded like regular static, but there was a rhythm to it, a pattern. I leaned closer to the receiver, turning up the volume. It wasn't music or speech, but it wasn't random either. It was like someone trying to say something but not quite getting through. "Tina," I called out through the open window. "Come here for a second." She groaned but got up and climbed into the RV. "What now?" she asked. brushing dust off her jeans. "Listen," I said, pointing to the receiver. She tilted her head and frowned. "That's just static." "No," I said quickly. "Listen closer." We both leaned in, and for a moment, there was silence, except for the crackling sound coming from the speakers. Then it happened, a faint voice buried deep in the noise. It wasn't clear enough to make out words, but it was there. "Is that someone talking?" Tina asked, her voice uncertain. I nodded slowly. "I think so." "Who?" she asked. "I don't," said no. I admitted. I adjusted the dials again, trying to sharpen the signal. The voice faded in and out like it was fighting to be heard. My heart started beating faster, not in fear, but in curiosity. This was what I lived for, finding something unexpected on the airwaves. But then Tina stepped back suddenly, her face pale. "Dad," she whispered, "turn it off." "What? Why?" I asked. "It sets creepy," she said firmly. "It sounds wrong." I hesitated, but eventually turned off the receiver. The RV fell silent again except for the faint sound of wind outside. Its steps probably just interference. I said casually, trying to lighten the mood. "Nothing to worry about." Tina didn't look convinced. She muttered something about going back outside and climbed out of the RV without another word. I stayed inside for a while longer, staring at my equipment and wondering what we'd just heard. It wasn't interference. I knew that much, but I didn't want to scare her. Whatever it was, it felt like it wasn't done with us yet. The night grew darker, and the meteor shower began. Tiny streaks of light raced across the sky, leaving faint trails behind them. Tina was outside again, lying on her blanket with her book beside her, but she wasn't reading anymore. She was watching the meteors, quiet and still. I stayed in the RV, fiddling with my equipment. I couldn't stop thinking about that voice. I turned the receiver back on, keeping the volume low so Tina wouldn't hear. The static returned immediately, but this time it felt heavier, like it was pressing against me. I adjusted the dials again, searching for that strange signal, and then there it was. The voice came back, clearer than before. It wasn't speaking in full sentences, just fragments of words broken and distorted. "Human, biology, transmit." The words sent a chill down my spine. They didn't make sense, but they sounded deliberate. Suddenly, the lights in the RV flickered. I froze, staring at the overhead bulb as it dimmed and brightened like it was struggling to stay on. My stomach tightened. This wasn't normal. Then the radio started acting up. The knobs turned by themselves, spinning wildly as if someone invisible was controlling them. The static grew louder, almost deafening, and the voice became clearer. "Raymond," it said. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It knew my name. "Raymond," it repeated, slower this time. I reached out to turn off the receiver, but before I could touch it, every piece of equipment in the RV powered on at once, lights flashing, screens glowing, speakers crackling with noise. Even devices that weren't plugged in started working, their displays flickering erratically. "Dad," Tina Sepp's voice called from outside. I jumped up and ran to the door. She was standing by the RV steps, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "What's Sepp's going on?" she asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. She pointed to the sky. "Look." I followed her gaze and saw something strange. A faint glow hovering above us, almost like a second moon but smaller and pulsing with light. It wasn't a meteor or a star. It was something else entirely. "Get inside," I said quickly, pulling her into the RV. The moment we stepped in, everything went quiet. The lights stopped flickering, the equipment powered down, and the static disappeared. It was like nothing had happened at all. Tina looked at me with wide eyes. "Dad, what's Sepp's happening?" I didn't have an answer for her. All I knew was that whatever we'd heard on the radio wasn't just noise anymore. It was something real, something watching us. The RV was quiet now, but the silence didn't feel comforting. It felt heavy, like the air around us had thickened. Tina sat on the couch, hugging her knees to her chest. She wasn't the type to get scared easily, but tonight was different. I could see it in her eyes. I tried to act calm, Even though my heart was pounding, "It steps probably just some kind of interference," I said, forcing a smile. "Maybe a satellite or something." Tina shook her head. "Satellites don't say your name." She was right. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I didn't want to admit that, not to her and not to myself. I decided to turn the radio back on. Tina protested immediately. "Dawn's set," she said sharply. "Please, Dad, Dawn's set." "It sets okay," I said softly. "I just want to check something." The receiver crackled to life again, and for a moment it was just static. But then the voice returned, clearer than ever. "Tina," it said. Her head snapped up, and she stared at the radio in horror. "Tina," it repeated, slower this time. She backed away, pressing herself against the wall of the RV. "How does it know my name?" she whispered. I didn't answer because I didn't know. The voice wasn't distorted anymore. It sounded almost human, but there was something off about it. It was too smooth, too precise. "Why do you fear?" the voice asked. Tina looked at me, her face pale. "Dad, turn it off." I reached for the power switch, but before I could touch it, the lights in the RV flickered again. The voice grew louder, filling the small space with its eerie calmness. "Why do you fear?" it repeated. Suddenly, every metal object in the RV began to vibrate, small things like spoons and screws rattling against the countertops, while larger pieces like my antenna rig shifted slightly on their mounts. It felt like the whole RV was alive. "Dad," Tina screamed. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward me as a strange sound filled the air, a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The vibrations grew stronger, and then they stopped. Everything went still. The lights stabilized, the radio powered down on its own, and the hum disappeared. The only sound left was our breathing. Tina looked at me with tears in her eyes. "What is happening?" I didn't know how to answer her. All I knew was that whatever we were dealing with wasn't just a voice on the radio anymore. It was here with us. After what felt like hours of silence, I decided we couldn't stay in the RV any longer. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop. We needed answers. I remembered seeing another campsite a few miles away when we first arrived, a lone tent with a small fire burning. Maybe whoever was there could help us, or at least tell us if they'd seen anything strange. "Tina," I said gently, "we set going to take a walk." She looked at me like I was crazy. "Out there? Are you serious?" "We can stay here," I said firmly. "Come on." Reluctantly, she grabbed her jacket and followed me outside. The desert was eerily quiet, the stars above shining brighter than ever. The glow we'd seen earlier was gone, but the air still felt wrong, heavy. We walked in silence for a while, the crunch of our footsteps on the dry ground the only sound. Tina stayed close to me, her eyes darting around nervously. I couldn't blame her. I felt it too, like we were being watched. Eventually, we reached the campsite. A woman was sitting by the fire, her face lit by the flickering flames. She looked older, maybe in her 50s, with short gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. "Hi," I said cautiously as we approached. "Sorry to bother you, but have you seen or heard anything strange tonight?" The woman didn't look surprised by my question. She set down the mug she'd been holding and stood up slowly. "You must be Raymond," she said. I froze. "How do you know my name?" She gave me a small smile, but it wasn't comforting. It was knowing, like she understood something I didn't. "Hold. I heard it on my radio," she said simply. Tina grabbed my arm tightly. "Dad." The woman's name was Dr. Helen Maxwell, and as it turned out, she wasn't just camping for fun. She was a nuclear physicist studying radiation levels in the desert. But there was more to her story than that. "This area isn't set just any desert," she explained as we sat by her fire. "Back in the 1950s, there were experiments here, classified projects involving electromagnetic waves and non-terrestrial communication." "Non-terrestrial?" I repeated. She nodded grimly. "They were trying to contact something out there." "What happened?" Tina asked quietly. Dr. Maxwell hesitated before answering. "They succeeded." The words hung in the air like a weight pressing down on us. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaky. "They made contact with something that doesn't belong in our world," she said carefully. "Something that exists between dimensions. Something that uses electromagnetic waves to travel." I stared at her in disbelief. It sounded insane, but after what we'd experienced tonight, it also made sense. "Is that what's happening to us?" Tina asked. Dr. Maxwell looked at her with an expression I couldn't quite read, sympathy mixed with fear. "It's possible," she admitted. "If your equipment picked up its signal, then yes." I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just interference or some strange coincidence. This was real, and it wasn't going away. We walked back to the RV in silence. The weight of Dr. Maxwell's words hanging over us like a storm cloud. Tina stayed close to me, her head down, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. I didn't know what was happening, and I didn't know how to stop it. When we reached the RV, something felt off. The air was colder than before, and the desert sip's usual silence was replaced by a faint hum, so low you could almost feel it more than hear it. Tina noticed it too. She stopped just outside the door and whispered, "Dad, do you hear that?" I nodded, my stomach tightening. "Stay close," I said as I opened the door. Inside, the RV was a mess. Metal objects, spoons, bolts, even pieces of my radio equipment were scattered across the floor as if they'd been thrown around by some invisible force. The air smelled faintly of burnt electronics, sharp and acrid. "What happened?" Tina asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said quietly. But in my gut, I had a terrible feeling that this wasn't random. As I stepped further inside, something caught my eye, a small pile of metal objects in the corner of the RV. They weren't just scattered, they were arranged. It looked like a shape, a crude figure, almost like a spider made out of screws and wires. Tina gasped when she saw it. "What is that?" Before I could answer, the lights flickered again, casting strange shadows across the walls. The hum grew louder, and suddenly the radio, completely unplugged, crackled to life. "Raymond," the voice said again. This time it was clearer than ever. Tina clutched my arm tightly. "Turn it off," she cried. "I can't," I said helplessly. The radio wasn't even connected to power. The voice continued. "You brought us here." "What does that mean?" Tina whispered. I didn't know how to respond. My mind raced through possibilities. Was this some kind of prank? A malfunction? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. This was something else entirely. Suddenly, Tina let out a sharp cry and grabbed her nose. Blood trickled down her face, bright red against her pale skin. "Tina," I shouted, rushing to her side. "It's burning," she said, through gritted teeth, her voice shaking with pain. I grabbed a tissue and pressed it to her nose, trying to stop the bleeding, but as I did, I noticed something horrifying. Her eyes were unfocused, staring at nothing. "Tina," I shook her gently. "Look at me." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she blinked rapidly and looked at me with wide eyes filled with fear. "Dad." I heard it. "Heard what?" I asked urgently. "The voice," she whispered. It was inside my head. My blood ran cold. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just using my equipment anymore. It was getting closer to us. The night dragged on, each moment feeling heavier than the last. Tina was restless, pacing back and forth in the RV, her hands trembling. I tried to comfort her, but she wouldn't sit still. She kept muttering about the voice, how it had been inside her head, how it had whispered things she couldn't understand. "I can stay here," she said suddenly, grabbing her jacket. "I need air." "Tina, wait," I said, but she was already out the door. I followed her into the cold desert night, calling her name as she walked away from the RV. "Tina, don't go too far." She didn't answer. Her steps were quick and determined, heading toward the horizon where the faint glow of the abandoned nuclear test site was visible. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. That place wasn't safe. It had been left untouched for decades, poisoned by radiation and forgotten by time. "Tina!" I shouted again, running after her. When I reached her, she was standing still, staring at something in the distance. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, or maybe fascination. I followed her gaze and saw what had stopped her. It was an old communications tower, rusted and broken, standing alone in the middle of the desert like a ghost from another era. Beneath it was a small building, its windows shattered and its roof caved in, but inside there was light. A faint blue glow spilled out from the building's doorway, pulsing like a heartbeat. It wasn't natural. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. "Dad," Tina whispered, her voice trembling. I grabbed her arm tightly. "No," I said firmly. "We said her going back." But before I could pull her away, she broke free and ran toward the building. "Tina!" I shouted, chasing after her. She disappeared inside before I could catch up. When I reached the doorway, I stopped cold. The air inside felt wrong, thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The blue glow lit up the room, revealing old equipment covered in dust and cobwebs. And there, standing in front of one of the machines, was Tina. She was staring at an old radio transmitter, one that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but it was working. The dials spun by themselves, and the speakers crackled with static. "Tina," I said softly, stepping closer to her. She turned to look at me, but her eyes weren't right. They were distant, unfocused, like she wasn't fully there anymore. "It's Seps here," she said quietly. "What's Seps here?" I asked desperately. Before she could answer, the static grew louder, filling the room with its eerie hum. The glow intensified, and then everything went dark. When I woke up, the blue glow was gone, and the room was pitch black. My head throbbed, and my ears were ringing like I'd been standing too close to an explosion. "Tina!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. She wasn't there. I stumbled out of the building, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The desert felt colder now, and the faint hum that had followed us earlier was back, louder than ever. I called her name again and again, but there was no response. Panic clawed at my chest. She couldn't have gone far. I had to find her. Then I saw it. Near the old communications tower, something was moving, a shape that didn't belong. It shimmered in the moonlight, its surface made entirely of metal objects, screws, bolts, wires, and pieces of machinery. It wasn't just a pile, it was alive. The thing stood upright, vaguely humanoid, with glowing points scattered across its body like stars in a constellation. I froze in place as it turned toward me. Its face wasn't a face at all, just a hollow space surrounded by jagged edges of metal, but I could feel it looking at me. "Raymond," it said in the same voice that had haunted us all night. I took a step back, my heart racing. "Where's Tina?" I demanded. It didn't answer right away. Instead, it moved closer, its metal limbs clinking softly with each step. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting everything nearby. I felt dizzy, like time itself was bending. "She is ours," the voice said finally. "No," I shouted. "You can have her." The entity tilted its head, or what passed for a head, and then raised one of its arms. A faint glow appeared at its fingertips, pulsing like electricity. Suddenly, Tina's voice echoed through the air. "Dad?" she whispered weakly. I turned toward the sound and saw her lying on the ground near the tower. Her face was pale, her eyes half closed, and her body looked limp, like she'd been drained of energy. I ran to her side and shook her gently. "Tina, wake up." Her lips moved faintly as she whispered something. "It sets inside me." My stomach dropped. The entity wasn't just trying to communicate, it was trying to take her over. I looked back at the RV in the distance and remembered something: my equipment. If I could create an electromagnetic pulse using what I had left, maybe I could disrupt whatever this thing was doing to her. With no time to waste, I carried Tina back to the RV as fast as I could. The entity followed us slowly but steadily, its glowing points flickering brighter with each step. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. It knew we couldn't escape. Inside the RV, I laid Tina on the couch and frantically began pulling wires and connectors from my radio equipment. My hands shook as I worked. There was no room for error. The entity reached the RV door and stepped inside without hesitation. Its presence made every light flicker wildly, and the hum grew deafening. "Raymond," it said again, but this time its voice seemed layered, like multiple voices speaking at once. I ignored it and kept working until finally I had it ready. A crude EMP generator made from my beloved equipment. It would fry everything electronic in the RV, including my radio, but if it saved Tina, it would be worth it. The entity raised its arm again, glowing brighter than ever as it reached for Tina. "No," I shouted as I hit the switch. A burst of electromagnetic energy erupted from the generator, filling the RV with blinding light and an ear-splitting crackle. The entity let out a distorted scream as its metal body convulsed violently before collapsing into a heap of parts on the floor. The lights went out completely, leaving us in silence once more. "Tina," I whispered desperately as I knelt beside her. She opened her eyes slowly and looked at me with tears streaming down her face. "Dad?" I hugged her tightly as relief washed over me. We were safe for now. It's been 3 months since that night in the desert, but it still feels like yesterday. Tina and I made it back home safely, but things haven't been the same, not really. I got rid of all my radio equipment, every last piece. The RV is parked in the driveway now, gathering dust. I can't bring myself to go inside it anymore. It feels tainted, like a reminder of something I'd rather forget. Tina seems okay, at least on the surface. She's back in school, doing well in her classes, even winning first prize at the science fair for her project on radio waves. But sometimes, I catch her staring off into space, her expression distant and unreadable. When I ask if she's okay, she always smiles and says she's fine, but it doesn't feel real. And then there are the incidents. It started small. Our TV turning on by itself late at night, the microwave beeping without anyone touching it. At first, I thought it was just faulty wiring or old appliances acting up. But then one day, I walked into Tina's room and found her sitting at her desk, staring at her laptop screen. "Tina," I said softly. She didn't respond right away. When she finally turned to look at me, her face was calm, too calm. "It's still transmitting," she said quietly. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked. She just smiled, a strange, unnatural smile that didn't reach her eyes, and turned back to her laptop. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, the faint hum. It was coming from somewhere in the house, soft but unmistakable. I got up and followed the sound to the living room, where the TV had turned itself on again. The screen was filled with static, but buried deep within the noise. I could swear I heard a voice. "Raymond," it whispered. I turned off the TV and stood there in the dark for a long time, listening to the silence. Whatever we encountered in the desert, it's not gone. It never left. And somehow, deep down, I know it's not finished with us yet. My name is Elliot Harmon. I'm 42 years old, and I used to be a forest ranger up in northern Minnesota. 2 years ago, I left that job after something happened, something I don't like to talk about, but I guess I'll tell you now, because it's important to this story. Back in 1974, I found 3 hikers in the woods. They were mutilated, torn apart like animals. It messed me up pretty bad, and ever since, I've had nightmares about it. Some nights, I wake up hearing their screams. My wife Diana thought a trip might help me clear my head. She's a nurse, always trying to fix me, and she suggested we take our old RV out for a little adventure before winter hit. She thought being out in the woods again might help me face my fears or something like that. I wasn't sure it was a good idea, but Diana's stubborn when she sets her mind on something, so here we are. We drove up to the Boundary Waters in late autumn during one of those rare Indian summers when the weather stays warm longer than it should. The trees were still full of color, and the air had this strange stillness about it, like the world was holding its breath. We found a spot called Pine Point, way out in the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to be popular with campers, but when we got there, it was empty, completely deserted. The campsite was surrounded by tall pine trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The lake nearby was calm and glassy, reflecting the orange stripe on our old Winnebago Brave like a mirror. Diana thought it was beautiful, but something about the quiet bothered me. There were no birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just silence. As we parked the RV and started setting up camp, our dog Max started acting strange. He's usually full of energy, but he wouldn't leave the RV. He just sat there growling at the tree line, his ears pinned back and his fur standing on end. Diana laughed it off, saying he was probably just nervous about being in a new place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it as we unpacked and settled in for the night. Diana made dinner while I checked out the area around our campsite. The woods felt off somehow. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet, like even nature didn't want to be here. That night, as we sat by the campfire under a sky full of stars, I told myself this trip might actually be good for me. Maybe Diana was right. Maybe facing my fears would help me move on from what happened 2 years ago. But deep down, I knew this place wasn't set normal. That first night, I didn't sleep well. Max kept growling softly, his nose pressed against the RV door. Every now and then he'd let out a low whine, like he was scared of something outside. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop. Diana told me to ignore him and get some rest, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. The next morning, things got even stranger. Diana opened one of the cabinets to grab some bread for breakfast, and her face went pale. "Elliot," she called out, "come look at this." I walked over and saw what she was talking about. The bread was covered in mold, green and fuzzy, like it had been sitting there for months, but we just bought it 2 days ago. I checked the rest of our food and it was the same story. The fruit was rotting, the milk had gone sour, and even the canned goods smelled off. "That's not normal," I muttered. Diana tried to brush it off, saying maybe the RV fridge wasn't working right or something, but I knew better. It didn't make sense for everything to spoil so fast. We decided to ration what little food we had left and make a plan to leave the next day. But as the day went on, things kept getting weirder. While Diana was reading by the lake, I decided to gather some firewood from the edge of the woods. As I walked through the trees, I started hearing something faint, so faint that at first I thought I was imagining it. It sounded like someone screaming far off in the distance. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and then I recognized it. The screams were exactly like the ones I'd heard 2 years ago when I found those hikers in the woods. I dropped the firewood and ran back to the campsite as fast as I could. When I got there, Diana looked up at me with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing," I lied, trying to catch my breath. "I just thought I heard something." She frowned, but didn't push me for details. I didn't want to scare her, or admit that maybe my mind was playing tricks on me again. That night, Max refused to leave my side. He stayed curled up at my feet, while Diana slept soundly next to me, but I couldn't sleep, not with those screams echoing in my head. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained. Diana seemed fine though, humming to herself as she made coffee. She always had this way of staying calm no matter what, but I could tell she was worried about me. "You look like you didn't sleep at all," she said, handing me a cup. "I didn't I admitted. Max kept growling all night. She glanced at the dog, who was sitting by the RV door again, staring at the tree line like something was out there. "Maybe he's just not used to the woods," she said, trying to sound reassuring. I nodded, but I didn't believe it. Max wasn't just nervous, he was scared. And honestly, so was I. Later that morning, while Diana was cleaning up around the RV, I decided to take a short walk to clear my head. The woods were still eerily quiet, and the air felt heavier than usual, like it was pressing down on me. As I walked along the edge of the lake, I saw a man standing near the water. He was older, probably in his 60s, and dressed in worn-out clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. He had a long gray beard and a weathered face that made him look like he'd been living out here for years. "Morning," I said cautiously as I approached him. He turned to look at me, his eyes sharp and serious. "You shouldn't be here," he said flatly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "This place isn't set safe," he replied, his voice low and steady. "There's something out there in those woods. Something that doesn't belong." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you talking about?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "The hunger in the trees," he said cryptically. "It's been here for centuries, but it's worse now ever since they built that dam." I didn't know what to say. His words sounded crazy, but there was something about the way he said them that made me believe him. "Listen," he continued, stepping closer to me. "If you hear voices or see things that don't make sense, leave. Don't wait around to figure it out." Before I could ask him anything else, he walked off into the woods without another word. I stood there for a while, staring after him and trying to make sense of what he'd said. The hunger in the trees? What did that even mean? When I got back to the campsite, Diana noticed the look on my face right away. "What happened?" she asked. "I met someone," I said slowly, still trying to process it all. "An old man. He warned me about this place." Diana raised an eyebrow. "Warned you about what?" I shook my head. "I don't know exactly, something about the woods not being safe." She sighed and put her hand on my arm. "Elliot, you're letting your imagination get the best of you again." "Maybe," I muttered, though deep down I knew it wasn't just my imagination. That night, things took another turn for the worse. That night, the wind picked up. It wasn't stormy, but the air felt restless, like something was moving through the trees. Diana and I sat inside the RV, playing cards to distract ourselves. Max stayed by the door again, his growling louder now, like whatever he sensed was getting closer. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't Max this time, it was Diana. She wasn't in bed. I looked around and saw her standing by the RV door, her hand on the handle like she was about to open it. "Diana?" I called softly, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. Her head was tilted slightly, and she was staring at the tree line outside the window. I got up carefully and walked over to her. "Hey," I said again, touching her shoulder. She turned slowly to look at me, her eyes glassy and distant. "I'm hungry," she whispered. "What?" I asked, confused. "I'm starving," she said again, her voice trembling. "I need to go out there." I grabbed her arm firmly but gently. "No, you don't I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You're sleepwalking or something. Come back to bed." She blinked a few times and seemed to snap out of it. "What? What happened?" she asked, looking around like she didn't know where she was. "You were standing by the door," I explained. "You said you were hungry." She frowned deeply and shook her head. "I don't remember any of that." I led her back to bed and stayed awake for the rest of the night, watching over her while Max kept growling at the door. The next morning, we woke up to find that a massive tree had fallen across the narrow dirt road leading out of Pine Point. It wasn't just any tree, it was huge, with thick roots that looked like they'd been yanked out of the ground by something powerful. "We can't move that," Diana said nervously as we stared at it. I nodded grimly. "Looks like we're stuck here for now." We tried using the RV radio to call for help, but all we got was static. Every now and then, though, there'd be a faint whisper cutting through the noise, like someone was trying to talk to us but couldn't quite get through. "Hello?" Diana said into the mic repeatedly, her voice growing more frantic each time, but there was no response, just more whispers and static. As the day went on, Diana started acting strange again. She kept complaining about how hungry she was, even though she'd eaten more than me earlier. Her face looked pale and tired, and her hands shook whenever she tried to do anything. Meanwhile, I started seeing things, or at least I thought I did. When I glanced out one of the RV windows late in the afternoon, I saw 3 figures standing near the tree line. They weren't moving, they were just standing there, staring at me. My stomach dropped as I realized who they were or who they looked like. The hikers from 2 years ago, the ones I'd found mutilated in the woods. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their clothes torn and bloody. I blinked hard and looked again, but they were gone. Elliot. Diana called from behind me. Are you okay? I turned quickly to face her. Yeah, I lied again. Just thought I saw something. She didn't say anything, but gave me a worried look before sitting back down. That night felt heavier than ever before, like something was pressing down on us from all sides. That night, the wind started howling. It wasn't just a breeze, it sounded like something alive, rushing through the trees and rattling the RV. Max was barking now, his growls turning into frantic yelps. Diana sat on the couch, her arms wrapped around herself, rocking back and forth. I can take this anymore, she whispered, her voice shaky. I feel like I sit losing my mind. I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't know how. I felt the same way, like the woods were closing in on us, like something was watching every move we made. Around midnight, the storm hit its peak. The RV shook as the wind slammed against it, and the static on the radio grew louder. I thought I heard whispers again, but this time they sounded closer, like they were coming from right outside. Then Diana disappeared. I didn't even see her leave. I just turned around, and she was gone. The RV door was wide open, swinging in the wind. Max was barking furiously at the tree line, his tail low and his ears pinned back. Diana, I shouted as I ran outside into the storm. The wind whipped around me, making it hard to see or hear anything. I called her name over and over, but there was no response. Just the sound of the wind and Max barking behind me. I ran toward the lake, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I found her clothes, torn and bloody, lying in a crumpled heap near the water's edge. My stomach turned as I picked them up, my hands shaking. Diana, I screamed again, my voice breaking. I looked around frantically but saw nothing. No footprints, no signs of where she might have gone. Just those bloody clothes and the still surface of the lake reflecting the dark sky above. Then I saw something else. A series of carvings etched into a large rock near the water. They looked ancient, like they'd been there for centuries. The images showed a tall figure with antlers standing over a group of people who were kneeling before it. Below that was another image, a lake with something trapped underneath it. I stared at the carvings for what felt like forever before it clicked. The dam. The old man had mentioned it earlier. The new dam must have drained part of this lake, releasing whatever had been trapped beneath it all those years ago. The Wendigo. It wasn't just a legend, it was real. And now it was out here in these woods with us. I turned back toward the RV, my mind racing. If Diana was still alive, and I prayed that she was, I needed to find her fast before whatever this thing was got to her first. But deep down, I knew time was running out. I ran back to the RV, my legs shaking and my breath coming in short gasps. Max was still barking, pacing nervously near the open door. I grabbed a flashlight and a hunting knife I kept for emergencies. I didn't know what I was planning to do, but I couldn't just sit there and wait. Stay here, Max, I said, though he didn't seem to want to leave my side. He whined loudly as I stepped out into the storm again, shining the flashlight into the woods. The trees swayed violently in the wind, their shadows twisting and stretching across the ground like long fingers. I kept calling Diana's name as I moved deeper into the forest, but my voice sounded small against the roar of the storm. Then I heard it, a voice calling back. Elliot. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but as I moved closer, it grew louder. Elliot, help me. It was Diana Sipp's voice. I felt a surge of hope and started running toward the sound. Diana, I shouted. Where are you? But something about her voice wasn't right. It sounded too perfect, like a recording being played back to me. And then it hit me. Marcus's warning about voices that don't make sense. I stopped in my tracks, shining the flashlight wildly around me. Diana. I called again, but this time my voice was trembling. The forest went silent. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow. A tall figure standing between two trees, but as I moved the flashlight toward it, its shape became clearer. It was massive, at least 9 feet tall, with long, emaciated limbs that looked like they could snap in half at any moment. Its head was a deer skull, with empty eye sockets that seemed to stare right through me. The Wendigo. I froze in place, unable to move or even breathe. It didn't make a sound, it just stood there watching me. Then it tilted its head slightly and started walking toward me. Its movements were unnatural, almost like it was gliding rather than stepping. The trees around it didn't rustle or sway, it was like it wasn't even part of this world. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Stay away," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. The creature stopped suddenly and crouched low to the ground. That's when I realized what it wanted. It wasn't just hunting me, it was feeding off my fear. I remembered Marcus's warning, fear and hunger. That's what attracted it. My mind raced as I tried to think of a plan. The RV, it was metal and sturdy enough to hold for a while if I could lure it inside, maybe if I could trap it somehow. I turned and ran back toward the campsite as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The Wendigo followed silently, its presence pressing down on me like a weight on my chest. When I reached the RV, Max started barking again, his teeth bared and his fur standing on end. "Get inside." I shouted at him as I opened the door and climbed in. Max hesitated for a moment before jumping inside after me. I slammed the door shut just as the Wendigo reached the edge of the campsite. It stood there for a moment, staring at the RV like it was deciding what to do next. Then it lunged forward, slamming into the side of the vehicle with enough force to make it shake. Max barked furiously, while I grabbed the keys and started the engine. The Wendigo clawed at the metal walls of the RV, its long fingers leaving deep scratches in the surface. "Come on," I muttered under my breath as I put the RV into gear and started driving toward the lake. The creature clung to the side of the RV as we barreled down the dirt road toward the water. Its claws tore through one of the windows, shattering glass everywhere. Max yelped and jumped onto my lap as I struggled to keep control of the wheel. When we reached the lake, I didn't hesitate. I drove straight into it. The RV hit the water with a loud splash and started sinking fast. The Wendigo let out an ear-piercing screech as water rushed in through the broken windows. I grabbed Max and kicked open one of the doors before swimming out into the cold lake water. When I turned back, I saw the RV sinking deeper into the lake with the Wendigo still inside. For a moment, everything went quiet, just me floating in the water with Max paddling beside me, and then it was gone. It's been a month since that night at Pine Point. I don't know how I made it out of the lake alive. After the RV sank, I swam to shore with Max and collapsed there, shivering and gasping for air. Diana. She never came back. I searched for her for hours, calling her name until my voice gave out, but deep down, I knew she was gone. Whatever that thing was, it had taken her. Eventually, I managed to hike out of the woods with Max by my side. It felt like the forest was watching me the whole way, but nothing else happened. When I finally reached a ranger station, I told them everything. They didn't believe me, of course. They said Diana must have gotten lost in the storm and that I was lucky to survive the lake crash. But I know the truth. The Wendigo is still out there waiting in those woods, feeding off fear and hunger. Last week, I heard about a family who went camping at Pine Point, despite the no camping signs that were put up after my report. A father, mother, and their little girl. The rangers said they left after one night. Something spooked them so badly that they packed up and drove away before sunrise. The little girl told her parents she saw someone in the woods, a tall man with antlers who was watching them from between the trees. I don't think Pine Point will ever be safe again. My name is Daniel Redfeather. I'm a wildlife biologist, part Navajo, part white, and I've spent most of my life studying animals. In the spring of 1993, my research brought me to the Navajo Nation lands near Canyon de Chelly, Arizona. My goal was to study the coyote populations in the area, track their movements, understand their behavior. It was supposed to be a simple field study, but nothing about what happened there was simple. I wasn't alone on this trip. My research partner and old college roommate, Michael Landon, came with me. Michael was a skeptic by nature, always quick to dismiss anything that didn't have a scientific explanation. He believed in data and logic, not stories or traditions. Me, I grew up hearing the old tales from my grandfather, but I never thought they could be real. At least, not until this trip. We arrived in early spring during an unusual cold snap. The air felt sharp and heavy, like it carried something unseen. The Red Rock Canyon stretched out before us, dotted with ancient cliff dwellings and pictographs left by people long gone. Some of those sites had warnings painted near them, symbols meant to keep people away. But Michael and I weren't there for history, we were there for science. Our base camp was a small RV, a beat-up 1988 Toyota Dolphin packed with tracking equipment, charts, and maps. It wasn't much, but it had everything we needed to work. On our first day there, we met Grace Tazazi, a Navajo elder from a nearby community. She was kind but firm when she spoke to us. "You shouldn't step here," she said, her voice low but steady. "This land is not just land, it's steps sacred. There are places where you don't step belong." Michael smiled politely but brushed her off. "Well, be careful," he said, as if that would solve everything. Grace shook her head and looked directly at me. "You should listen to the stories of your people," she said. "Some things are older than science." I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to believe her, another part thought she was just trying to scare us into leaving. Either way, we didn't listen. We set up camp in one of the restricted areas she warned us about, a quiet stretch of canyon surrounded by towering red walls. That night, as we settled into the RV and reviewed our plans for the next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't anything I could see or hear, just a weight in the air that made my skin crawl. Michael noticed me looking out the window. "Relax," he said with a chuckle. "It's just nerves. First nights always feel weird." I nodded and tried to push the feeling away, but deep down, I couldn't help but wonder if Grace had been right. The next morning started off like any other field work day. The sun rose over the canyon, painting the rocks in shades of orange and gold. Michael and I packed our gear, grabbed our tracking equipment, and headed out to look for signs of coyote activity. The area was quiet, too quiet. Usually you'd hear birds chirping or the wind moving through the canyon, but that morning there was nothing, just silence. We spent hours hiking through the rocky terrain, checking for tracks or scat that would tell us where the coyotes had been. At first, everything seemed normal, but as the day went on, we started noticing strange things. The first was the absence of coyotes. This area was supposed to be full of them. It's why we chose it for our study. But there were no tracks, no calls in the distance. Nothing to show they were even there. It was like they had vanished overnight. Then there were the sounds. Our recording equipment picked up something unusual while we were hiking, a high-pitched scream that echoed through the canyon. At first we thought it was an injured animal, maybe a rabbit or a bird, but as we listened closer, the sound changed. It started to sound human. Michael frowned as he adjusted the equipment. "It's probably just interference," he said, trying to sound confident. "Wind can do weird things to sound out here." I wasn't so sure. The scream didn't fade or distort like normal interference. It grew louder and clearer until it sounded like someone crying out for help. But when we followed the sound to its source, there was nothing there, just empty rocks and shadows. By late afternoon, we stumbled across something that made my stomach turn. A deer carcass lay in a dry creek bed, skinned with surgical precision. Its flesh was untouched. No bite marks or signs of a predator, but its hide was completely gone. Michael crouched down to examine it. "This is strange," he muttered, his voice quieter than usual. "Strange?" I said, staring at the lifeless body. "This isn't normal." He shrugged and pulled out his notebook to jot down some observations. "Maybe poachers," he said. Finally, though he didn't sound convinced. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something about this felt wrong. Poachers don't just take the skin and leave everything else behind, and they definitely don't work with this kind of precision. As we headed back to camp that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I thought I saw movement in the distance, a shadow darting between rocks or a flicker of something just out of view. But when I turned around fully, there was nothing there. Back at camp, things got even stranger. We had left some food outside earlier in the day, a sealed bag of trail mix, and when we returned, it was gone. Not torn open or scattered like an animal might do, just gone entirely. Michael laughed nervously as he checked around the RV for signs of wildlife. "Coyotes are smarter than you think," he said, with a forced grin. I didn't laugh. My eyes drifted to the roof of our RV where something new had appeared. Animal pelts, dozens of them, stacked neatly, as if someone had placed them there on purpose. "Michael," I whispered, pointing at the roof. He froze and followed my gaze upward. "What? How did those get up there?" Neither of us had an answer, and when we woke up the next morning, the pelts were gone. The second night was colder than the first, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you're wearing. Michael and I sat inside the RV, reviewing the recordings from the day. He was focused on the equipment, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to the skinned deer and those pelts on the roof. Something wasn't right, and I could feel it in my gut. Around midnight, the strange sound started again. At first, it was faint, like distant footsteps crunching on gravel, then came the tapping. It started softly, like someone drumming their fingers against the side of the RV. Michael looked up from his notes and raised an eyebrow. "Wind?" he asked, though his voice didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. "That's not wind." The tapping grew louder and more rhythmic, almost like it was mimicking the patterns from our recording equipment earlier that day. Tap, tap, pause, tap, 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 tap. It was deliberate, calculated. Michael grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the door. "What are you doing?" I hissed. "Relax," he said, forcing a smile. "It's probably just an animal." He opened the door and shined the flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but rocks and dirt. The tapping stopped immediately, replaced by silence, so heavy it felt like it was pressing down on us. Michael stepped outside to look around, and I followed reluctantly. The chill in the air seemed sharper out here, like it carried something unnatural with it. We scanned the area with our flashlights but found nothing, no tracks, no movement, no signs of life. Then we heard it, my name, Daniel. A voice called softly from somewhere in the shadows. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice sounded familiar, too familiar. It sounded like Michael. I whipped around to look at him, but he was standing right beside me, his flashlight aimed at a nearby rock formation. His face paled as he turned to me. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded slowly. "It sounded like you." We both stood there in silence, listening as the voice called out again, this time louder and closer. I felt my stomach twist as I scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. A figure stepping out from behind a rock about 20 yards away. At first glance, it looked like a coyote, but something was off. Its proportions were wrong. Its legs were too long, its movements too smooth for an animal. And then it stood up. The coyote rose onto its hind legs like a human and stared directly at us with glowing yellow eyes. My breath caught in my throat as it opened its mouth and spoke again. "Daniel." The voice was identical to Michael's, perfectly mimicked down to every inflection and tone. Michael stumbled backward, gripping my arm tightly. "What is that?" he gasped. I couldn't answer him because I didn't know. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing about this made sense. The figure tilted its head slightly as if studying us before turning and disappearing into the shadows with impossible speed, so fast that it left no footprints behind. Michael grabbed my arm again, his grip trembling. "We need to leave," he said urgently. But something told me leaving wouldn't be that simple anymore. The next day, Michael and I were both on edge. Neither of us said much as we packed up our gear and prepared to head out for more tracking. The encounter from the night before lingered in the air between us, unspoken but heavy. Michael tried to act like nothing had happened, but I could see it in his face. He was scared, and so was I. We decided to stick close to camp that day. Something about venturing deeper into the canyon felt wrong, like we were walking into a trap. As we hiked around the area, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again. But the canyon was empty. No animals, no sounds, just silence. By mid-afternoon, we found another carcass. This time it was a rabbit, skinned just like the deer we'd seen before. Its body was untouched, but its fur was gone without a trace. Michael crouched down to examine it, his hands shaking slightly. "This isn't normal," he muttered. "It sits, not poachers. It sits, not predators." "What sits doing this?" I didn't answer him because I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever was responsible wasn't human, or at least not entirely. As we made our way back to camp, the unease grew stronger. The shadows seemed longer than they should have been, and every gust of wind sounded like whispers. When we finally reached the RV, we stopped in our tracks. The engine had been dismantled. Parts of it were scattered across the ground in strange patterns, circles and lines that looked almost ritualistic. Michael stared at the mess with wide eyes. "Who would do this?" he stammered. I shook my head slowly. "Not who. What?" Before Michael could respond, we heard it again. The tapping. It started softly, just like the night before, but this time it came from all sides of the RV. Tap tap, pause, tap tap. It was deliberate and unrelenting, like it was trying to get inside our heads. Michael grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the RV door. "We need to call for help," he said urgently. We scrambled inside and grabbed the radio, but when Michael tried to make contact with someone, anyone, all we got was static. He adjusted the dials frantically, his breathing quick and shallow. Come on," he muttered under his breath. Then the static changed. It wasn't random noise anymore, it was voices. At first, they were faint and distorted, but soon they became clear enough to understand. "Daniel." One voice called out softly. "Michael." Another followed. The voices were ours, perfectly mimicked down to every detail. Michael dropped the radio like it had burned him, and backed away slowly. "This isn't set real," he whispered, shaking his head. "This can set be real." I wanted to tell him everything would be okay, but I couldn't bring myself to say it because I didn't believe it either. That night, something circled the Krabi again. We could hear its footsteps crunching on gravel and its nails scratching against the walls. Every so often, it would tap, always in those same deliberate patterns, and whisper our names in voices that weren't ours anymore. I barely slept that night, and when I did, my dreams were filled with images of hunting on all fours through the canyon, chasing prey with sharp teeth and glowing yellow eyes. When I woke up in the morning, my hands were covered in dirt and there were scratches on my arms that I couldn't explain. Michael stared at me from across the RV with a look of fear except never seen before. "Daniel," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "What's happening to you?" The morning after that restless night, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My body ached and my hands were caked with dirt. Michael was sitting across from me in the RV, staring at me like I was a stranger. His face was pale and his eyes were wide with fear. "Daniel," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "What's happening to you?" I didn't know how to answer him. I didn't even know what was happening to me. The dreams, the blackouts, the dirt on my hands, it all pointed to something I couldn't explain. But before I could say anything, Michael stood up abruptly and grabbed his gear. "But I'm going out," he said. "I need to figure this out." "Wait." I called after him. "We shouldn't split up." But he was already out the door, muttering something about needing answers. I wanted to stop him, but part of me was too afraid to leave the RV. Something about the canyon felt different that morning. Heavier, darker. It was like the land itself knew what was coming. Hours passed, and Michael didn't return. The sun started sinking behind the canyon walls, casting long shadows across the ground. I paced back and forth inside the RV, trying to convince myself that he was fine, that he'd come back any minute now. Then I heard a scream. It echoed through the canyon, sharp and desperate. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the echoes through the twisting paths of the canyon. The scream came again, louder this time, and then it stopped. When I found Michael, my stomach turned. He was hanging upside down from a tree, alive but barely conscious. His shirt was torn, and patches of his skin were missing, peeled away like someone had carefully removed them. Blood dripped from his wounds onto the dirt below. "Michael," I shouted, rushing toward him. His eyes fluttered open as I cut him down from the tree. He collapsed into my arms, trembling and mumbling incoherently. Then he looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. "You did this," he whispered. I froze, staring at him in disbelief. "What are you talking about? I just got here." But he shook his head weakly. "It was you, or something that looked like you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was it possible? Could I have done this during one of my blackouts? Or was something else playing tricks on us? Something that wanted us to turn on each other? I carried Michael back to camp as quickly as I could, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. When we reached the RV, I laid him down on one of the bunks and grabbed the first aid kit to clean his wounds. As I worked, something caught my eye, a small leather-bound journal sticking out of one of the storage compartments. It wasn't mine or Michael's. It looked old and worn, like it had been there for decades. Curious, I opened it and began flipping through its pages. The handwriting was messy but familiar. It belonged to my grandfather. The entries described his own encounters with skinwalkers in this same area years ago. "They are not just creatures," one entry read. "They are curses, punishments for those who trespass where they don't belong." Another entry sent chills down my spine. "The curse runs in our bloodline. They will come for us if we do not respect their warnings." I stared at the journal in disbelief as pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. This wasn't just about science or superstition. It was personal. As night fell over the canyon once again, I knew one thing for certain: whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it had finished what it started. The night was suffocatingly quiet. Michael was lying on the bunk, barely conscious, his breathing shallow. Every so often he'd mumble something incoherent, his voice weak and trembling. I sat across from him, clutching my grandfather's journal like it was the only thing keeping me sane. The entries swirled in my mind, warnings about curses, rituals, and the skinwalkers who punished those who ignored them. I knew I couldn't stay in the RV forever. Whatever was out there wasn't going to leave us alone. It wanted something from me, and I had a feeling it wouldn't stop until it got it. As I flipped through the journal again, I found a passage about protective charms and rituals that could trap a skinwalker between worlds. My grandfather had used them once before, but he warned that they came with a price. "The curse will always linger," he wrote, "even if you survive." I didn't have time to think about what that meant. I grabbed the journal and stepped outside into the cold night air. The canyon felt alive around me, like the rocks and shadows were watching my every move. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. The skinwalker stepped out from behind a boulder, its yellow eyes glowing like fire in the darkness. This time, it didn't look like an animal. It looked human, but its proportions were wrong, stretched and twisted in ways that made my stomach churn. It was wearing patches of skin, Michael's skin, and it smiled at me with teeth too sharp to belong to a person. "Daniel," it said in a voice that wasn't mine but still felt like it came from inside me. I froze as it took a step closer, its movements impossibly smooth and fast. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I didn't move. Instead, I held up the journal and began reciting the ritual my grandfather had written down. The skinwalker tilted its head curiously as I spoke, its smile widening. "You think words will save you?" it hissed. I ignored it and kept chanting, my voice shaking but steady enough to keep going. The air around me grew heavier with each word, like something was pressing down on me from all sides. The skinwalker snarled and lunged forward, stopping just inches away from me. Its yellow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt my body freeze completely, paralyzed by its gaze. My heart raced as it reached out with one hand, its fingers covered in patches of stolen skin. "Join us," it whispered softly. It seeps in your blood. I felt its hand brush against my arm, and for a moment, everything went dark. Images flashed through my mind, hunting on all fours through the canyon, tearing into flesh with sharp teeth, wearing skins that weren't mine. It wasn't just showing me these things, it was offering them to me. No, I shouted, forcing myself back into reality. With every ounce of strength I had left, I finished the chant. The air around us shifted suddenly, like the canyon itself was responding to the ritual. The skinwalker screamed as its body began to distort and twist violently. You cannot escape what you are. It howled as shadows engulfed its form. I watched as it disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but silence. The weight in the air lifted slightly, but I knew this wasn't over. Not entirely. When I returned to the RV, Michael was still lying on the bunk, his breathing steadier now, but his face pale and haunted. I sat down beside him and stared out the window at the canyon beyond. The ritual had worked for now, but my grandfather Sepp's warning echoed in my mind. The curse will always linger. 6 months have passed since that night in the canyon, but it still feels like it happened yesterday. Michael recovered physically, but he hasn't been the same since. He quit field work entirely and moved back to the city. We haven't spoken much, just a few strained phone calls here and there. I think he blames me for what happened, even if he doesn't say it outright. As for me, I went back to my research. My work on predator behavior has gained a lot of attention lately. Colleagues say my insights are groundbreaking, almost like I can see the world through the eyes of the animals I study. But they don't know the truth. They don't know what I saw or what I felt in that canyon. Sometimes, when I'm out in the field, I catch glimpses of things I can't explain. Shadows that move when they shouldn't. Animals that stop and stare at me like they recognize something in me. And then there's my reflection. In certain light, my eyes flash yellow just for a moment, but long enough to remind me of what I've become. The curse didn't leave with the skinwalker. It stayed with me, buried deep inside, waiting for the right moment to surface. I don't know what that means for me, or what's coming next. All I know is that the stories my grandfather told were true. Every single one of them. The land remembers. The curse lingers. And sometimes when the wind is just right, I swear I hear my name whispered in the distance.